Thanks to the Chase Center for having me. It's been a great weekend. So to advance this, okay, there we go. Okay, good. Throughout the educational sciences, problems and solutions go hand in hand. A common sense assumption is that reform should begin with an accurate understanding of educational problems themselves, and then be tailored, more or less specifically, to address a given problem. Today, a reform movement is underway in higher education encompassing a variety of concerns. Reformers point to an overemphasis on identity, including woke racism, an imbalance in the political affiliation of occupational incumbents, challenges to free speech, challenges to open inquiry and constructive debate. Additionally, civic education reforms are underway which seek to ameliorate insufficient classical civic education. In this talk, I will present these reforms as a movement which seeks to rebalance scholarship and practice in higher education away from hypercritical views of schooling and society toward more classical functional view of education and society. I believe a crisis really is underway in higher education, and that the American public is positively aghast at what they have learned about higher education in recent years. I do believe reform in higher education today is needed and will yield broadly recognized benefits. Admittedly, the current reform movement is a little hard to pin down, with different problems and solutions being variously emphasized. But these reforms have something in common, I think. I mean, most obviously, they are not critical. Beyond that, how should reformers think about the central problem facing us? I propose that higher education today suffers from a grave imbalance in value preoccupations. That is, the overly critical nature of higher education can be best characterized as a preoccupation with equity values and concurrent de-emphasis on the traditional values of excellence, efficiency, and choice. As the PowerPoint picture shows, value emphases in higher education are out of balance. In this talk, I will discuss the conceptual framing of this interpretation, including the basic distinction between the functional and conflict paradigms, how that relates to specific values, and why the imbalance in values is expressed most clearly in one sentiment in particular, preoccupations. Then I will revisit recent results from a study of values in higher education job postings that provides empirical validation for the proposed conceptual frame. This is the first study to empirically demonstrate a profound imbalance in values in faculty job postings. Moreover, the conceptual frame offers, I will argue, a promising tool to help confront and reform the overly critical ethos, policies, and practices in higher education. Has the hegemony of hypercritical scholarship really put higher education in crisis? I think yes, and there are many forms of evidence about this, including the balance of liberal conservative political orientation among faculty. We've heard some estimates of that this weekend. The growth of departments focused on identity-based inequality, the expansion of administrative positions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and even analyses of the scientific content and canonization of ideas in specific fields. All of these trends suggest a dramatic increase over the last 50 years in the prevalence of critical perspectives on education and society in higher education. Importantly, actions by the Trump administration and other conservative politicians are a reaction to this crisis. I won't debate here whether, on balance, those reactions will harm or hurt us in the long run. My point here is that the bans on DEI and other policies were clearly and explicitly formed as reactions to hypercritical scholarship and policy. Allow me to mention a few specific forms of evidence in more detail. Perhaps the most forceful statement of the crisis is John Ellis's 2020 book, The Breakdown of Higher Education. Ellis argues that American universities have become bastions of woke politics where critical theories of society dominate. Ellis argues that the trend toward ever greater adoption of politically left ideology has continued unabated for at least 4 decades. Ellis estimates the political imbalance in terms of the Democrat versus Republican breakdown to be in the range of 12-1, more Democrats. He argues that large fractions of faculty have abdicated their responsibility to cultivate students' analytic minds in favor of political indoctrination. But it's not easy empirically to actually show that this imbalance affects the quality of higher education in a causal fashion, as Ellis argues. Nevertheless, using more interpretive anecdotal evidence, Ellis makes the convincing argument, to me at least, that when students are pressured to accept one position, they are in effect being told to stop thinking. If you'd like a more personal example, which seems to encapsulate the crisis of the 2020s, read Phoebe Gloeckner's essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education, My Cartoonish Cancellation. Gloeckner, a fine artist, and I was just over at the Cartoon Museum here on campus appreciating that kind of art this weekend. Gloeckner was subjected to a terrifying and humiliating investigation about the content of her curriculum at the University of Michigan, where she works. At the end of her essay, she writes, "I was hired because of the creative work I've done. And there was a time when I was happy to share my work and the work of artists I admire with my students. The art that interests me, as well as my own art, is messy. As in life, ugliness and beauty coexist. Some might feel the need for a trigger warning on nearly every page. I now avoid talking about my work unless students ask me about it. I'm not proud of this. An artist who is afraid to show her own art. I found her story tremendously sad. It's something I never could have imagined from my days as an undergraduate student at UNC Chapel Hill. But it reminded me all too well of some of the challenges I've faced myself in the classroom in recent years over my own content. A crisis of authority is, I think, part of today's crisis. Gloeckner was very brave to write about what happened to her, and it has helped me and others. Finally, Nathan Honeycutt and Lee Jessam have studied political bias in the academic publishing process. Their methods include techniques like comparing patterns of citation among articles with different narratives and findings. Again, it's not easy empirically to demonstrate bias with certainty, but they find many patterns that seem consistent with the crisis. They conclude, our view is that many of the main professional psychology organizations have fully embraced activism and advocacy and are complicit in the canonization of works riddled with political biases. And I would say the same about professional organizations in education, in the educational sciences. The hegemony of hypercritical scholarship really has thrown higher education into crisis. Yet the nature of this crisis, the contours of it, what to do about it, and how not to go too far in reaction to it, these are difficult questions. And in all of this, I think the following conceptual frame will be helpful. The pyramid on this slide shows three sets of concepts that together offer a new, overarching conceptual frame to understand the crisis of the 2020s. I'll say more about each of these on subsequent slides. The pyramid is organized from most abstract at the bottom to most specific and personal or individualized at the top. First, at the bottom, is the basic distinction between functional and conflict perspectives on schooling and society. This is a conceptual frame we talk a lot about in the sociology of education. Broadly speaking, the left is conflict-oriented while the right is more functional. Second, in the middle, and really most core to the overarching frame and to the empirics of today's talk, is a set of four values identified by Wirt and colleagues in the 1980s. These four values are equity, quality, efficiency, and choice. This is a set of values specifically for the educational sciences and for understanding educational policy, but it works beyond that, I think. Third, at the top, and most individual, is Dan Lorty's basic typology of sentiments. Again, this is a frame developed specifically for the educational sciences, with Lorty analyzing teacher sentiments in particular, but I think it has broader application than that. Here, one sentiment in particular, preoccupations, is key. Carl Barks is the artist who created Uncle Scrooge, who, with a wealth of umpteen centrifugillion dollars, is the richest duck in the world. Barks must have thought a lot about whether society was fundamentally governed by functional or conflict forces. In this quote, I won't read it to you, Barks wrestles with the concept of exploitation. Barks was admittedly conservative, but his views on exploitation are only so functional. He clearly does acknowledge exploitation could become a concern. Next time you're hanging out with a conservative scholar, ask them if they even believe in the concept of exploitation. Some do not. In this quote, Barks is showing his conservative side. This is a quote meant to convey his conservative ideals, but his comics often featured critiques of big business and showed the little guy and the poor getting the better of old Uncle Scrooge. The functional and conflict paradigms have been around a long time. The functional paradigm includes the views that A, modern educational systems and occupational structures are meritocratic and value achievement above ascription, and that B, educational systems are functional. They create much needed knowledge, and C, we now live in expert societies that value expertise and where educational expansion, more and more of this higher ed that we do, is beneficial to society. It also includes the view, often linked with the work of Davis and Moore from 1945, that some amount of inequality is beneficial and functional to society, creating motivation and supporting the occupational system. This has been empirically verified by sociologists. The American occupational system really is governed by functional principles, at least to some substantial extent. In other words, some amount of inequality needs to be there because it helps the occupational system function properly. Proponents of the functional paradigm are most directly preoccupied with the values of quality or excellence, efficiency, and choice, in part because they do not believe all forms of inequality constitute a social problem, as Barks said, but also because they believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. That's a phrase you'll often hear associated with the functional paradigm. In contrast, the critical paradigm emphasizes that we live in a divided and competitive society and that the competition is inherently unequal and influenced by ascriptive factors. Beyond those basic tenets, different forms of the conflict perspective variously emphasize maybe exploitation, maybe status competition, and or the role of race-ethnic identities. Despite this heterogeneity, proponents of the critical paradigm are much more clearly preoccupied with equity than any other value. This preoccupation entails not just a general focus on reducing inequality, but a targeted emphasis on efforts to identify and ameliorate economic and social gaps related to race, ethnicity, family, social class background, gender, and other identities. These two paradigms loom large in the crisis of the 2020s, which in general represents the hegemony of the critical paradigm over the functional paradigm. The ever-changing empirical validities of these frames is what it is. But no matter how low the validity of the functional perspective may be, it shouldn't be forbidden, nor should advancing conflict perspectives be mandatory. Moving to the center of that pyramid, of that conceptual framework, is Wirt, Mitchell, and Marshall's four-part value typology. This is just a basic list of values, similar to what other social scientists have highlighted. There's a similar, slightly different list in economics used by Henry Levine, Doug Harris, and others. In econ, efficiency and excellence are usually treated, they're conjoined, they're usually treated together. But I think it's useful to keep those conceptually distinct, as Wirt et al. Do. Importantly, Wirt and colleagues empirically validated this typology to a certain extent by analyzing educational policy. As Table 3 from their original 88 article shows, across two different states, Illinois and Wisconsin, these values really do show up in all sorts of different educational policies and facets of educational policy making. The motivation for Wirt et al.'s original analysis is a little hard to parse. It appears to have been exploratory, and this work has not really been cited very much as I think it should be. Nevertheless, these are the values parents, educators, and the public really do care about. For example, research on educational reform in New Orleans since Katrina, where there was a tumult of reform after Katrina. It was really rapid and profound by educational standards. In that period, shows that these values keep coming up again and again. If you engage in school reform like the kind they did in New Orleans, the actors involved are likely to be grappling with these four values over and over and over again. Some very quick definitions in case you're wondering. I probably don't need to give these, but just real quick. Equity here refers to the use of public resources to redistribute resources and opportunities to satisfy disparities or gaps in human needs. Today, equity values often include a focus on promoting diversity, social justice, and inclusivity. Quality refers to the establishment, maintenance, and achievement of certain standards of excellence, proficiency, and superior ability. In a distributional sense, as discussed by the eminent sociologist James Coleman, quality refers both to average levels of performance and outcomes when we're talking about raising the mean of things, but also performance among the highest achieving. Efficiency refers to the effective use of resources to minimize costs, whether that's money, energy, or time, while maximizing performance and outcomes, which is why the economists have those conjoined. Additionally, though, it has an accountability form, referring to procedures and mechanisms that allow superiors in an authority system to oversee, control, and evaluate the performance of subordinates. Choice refers to offering a range of options for action and the ability to select a preferred option. Educational systems offer choice in materials, programs, even entire schools or pathways. Educational psychologists argue that choice is a basic determinant of motivation and engagement. Self-determination is just another way of saying self-determination is a powerful force. Have you seen these T-shirts? Easily distracted by whatever. My daughter has one about chickens. These are hilarious, but she really is easily distracted by chickens. Her friend down the street has a coop, and she carries the chickens around. She can't get enough of them. It's not quite a preoccupation, but it's headed in that direction. So that's just a funny thing related to the concept of preoccupations. Dan Lorty offers a basic typology of sentiments in the educational sciences. And here I'll broaden that a bit to go beyond education. First, we have beliefs about how the social world works. The functional and conflict paradigms entail contrasting beliefs about the social world. Second, we have preferences about how to negotiate social environments and how to solve social problems. And third, we have preoccupations, the elements of the social world that are salient to us. None of these things are easy to identify, and they shift around and change. In my research, for example, I've shown that teacher perspectives on authority and their beliefs, preferences, and preoccupations about authority in the classroom shift over the course of their career. But of the three forms of sentiments, preoccupations are perhaps the easiest to identify. They are the things we keep coming back to, the things we talk about. In academia, the things we write about and teach about, the things we are best able to elaborate on. To preface the findings in this talk, my colleagues and I do indeed find that faculty job postings communicate the value preoccupations of academic departments, of the colleges and schools, even the entire university. And we also find that they communicate expectations about the values they want faculty to be preoccupied with, they want their hires to be preoccupied with. James Coleman, who I mentioned previously, spent his career studying equity-related issues in education. The 1965 Coleman Report on equality of educational opportunity might be the most significant empirical study in the history of the educational sciences. But by the 1990s, where this quote is taken from, Coleman was ready to offer a different injunction to his social science audience. Inequality is not everything. If we are entirely focused on equity, our focus has become unbalanced. As a thought leader in the educational and social sciences, and in my personal scholarly lineage, Coleman's changing sentiments and those of scholars of his stature are important, or could have been important. but I think his injunction went largely unnoticed. This quote is from the foreword to Al Kirchhoff's 1993 book that was focused on inequality. In subsequent years, after Coleman wrote this, the preoccupation with equity in the educational sciences would only dramatically increase. And you will not be able to find too many injunctions similar to this by senior scholars. Did Coleman speak too quietly or too late? Or is it remarkable that he spoke up at all? In the remainder of this talk, I will discuss results from a study analyzing faculty job postings that puts this framework into action. Then I will conclude with larger observations and discussion about the use of this framework in higher education today. This study was funded by a small grant from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression and was a collaboration with colleagues in computer science. Diane Littman and Yang Zhang are the computer scientists on the team. And Chala and Gizem are students of mine. Gizem is in the School of Ed with me, and Chala is in the business school. This is an example of a job posting from late 2023 with a strong equity preoccupation. I've been encountering job postings like this for years. This is a job, apart from the preoccupation with equity, I would have been well suited for. I'm a full professor. I have administrative experience at the department and college level. That could have applied for this chair job. I was even born in State College. I lived on Beaver Avenue. I show up there with a lot of affinity for Penn State. It's a great university full of brilliant scholars, no question. If you're an anti-racist scholar, a posting like this must be music to your ears. In my case, not only am I not preoccupied with race, I don't even believe labeling an increasingly large set of individuals and phenomena as racist is a good idea. So in that way, I'm the opposite. I'm an anti-racist. I believe, following research in social psychology, that you can't promote tolerance and equality simply by labeling and shaming. Just the opposite, those kinds of efforts at persuasion will elicit an ego-defensive response. Instead, individuals are more likely to be receptive to an argument if it is closer to their existing, it's got to be real close, to their existing attitudes and beliefs. And people don't start by thinking of themselves as racist. The real determinants of intergroup conflict are related to opportunities for interaction, shared identity, and shared goals. But even if that was what was in the first paragraph, I still wouldn't want to apply for a chair job explicitly preoccupied with equity-related values. Allow me to change to the next set of slides. Got to pull up the slideshow? I've pulled it up. Here we are. Okay, good. It's pulling up the same one. No, this. Oh, it's just that you just put this at the end. I'm sorry. It was loaded to the last slide. Got it. Got it. Thank you so much. Oh. Thank you. Is this posting, the posting I just showed you, from PSU, just the tip of the iceberg? Or maybe it's an anomaly, and there really is no iceberg. We can't tell from our own haphazard job searching. Although the language used in that posting does seem awful familiar, it doesn't have a unique ring to it at all. I hear that kind of language all the time in my higher ed world. I wasn't surprised by this posting, not like Gladstone Gander when he spied that Viking ship in the iceberg from one of the great Karl Barks cartoons. There's that basic question of prevalence. How prevalent really is that posting for PSU? In addition to that question, basic question about prevalence, there's also the problem of a frame of reference. If one goes looking for over-the-top representations of equity values to put in an example slide, as I did, one can surely find it. But does this mean equity values are more prevalent than other values? Well, what about expressions of quality, efficiency, or choice? We need a comparative frame of reference. Thus, we must simultaneously look for multiple values in job postings. Our overall study design entailed using machine learning techniques developed with reference to gold standards from a rigorous human coding process to analyze the changing value content of faculty job postings. This human coding process is key. Artificial intelligence methods that haven't been validated for a specific task are a shot in the dark. At some point in the future, we may be willing to rely on a more global and abstracted validation, but for now, I don't trust machine learning methods that have not been validated on a gold standard specific to that exact thing you're looking at. So, using a web scraper, we first assembled a database of almost 67,000 higher education faculty job postings. Our sample includes all available faculty job postings from the years 2017 to 2024 at the time of extraction from the Chronicle of Higher Education in 3 position types: education, business and management, and the social and behavioral sciences. This represents 3 of the 9 faculty positions that institutions self-classify jobs into when they go to post a job on the Chronicle website. Our goal in selecting only 3 positions was to improve the tractability of human coding. If you assume some isomorphism is present by field, then we could thereby reduce the basic heterogeneity in what constitutes a faculty job posting, in what that coder has in front of them to look at, and improve the human coder's comprehension and interpretation by narrowing that task somewhat. So after we did the web scraping, a small sample of postings was then coded by the study team, following a training and reliability checking process. Our overall coding goal was to apply the word-it-all value typology to faculty job postings. An initial exploration of job postings suggested the utility of dividing the coding process into 4 focal domains for each posting: organizational priorities, values, and commitments, qualifications, job duties, function, and focus, and 4th, the focus of the professor's research or expertise if it wasn't a research position. While these domains were not absolutely universal, they were extremely common, and they were often even indicated by headers or other indicators in the postings. They often structured the posting itself. For each of the 4 domains, we coded the presence of values on an ordinal 4-point scale of not present, minimally present, present, and elaborated, meaning present and elaborated. Thus, we coded 16, a 4x4, set of individual value variables for each file. Thereafter, and independently, we provided a separate summary code identifying whether, from the coder's perspective, the job posting as a whole evinced a principal value, and if so, which of the 4 values was dominant. And then finally, we coded whether the posting required a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement as part of the application materials. Importantly, our goal was not to go looking for the presence of value emphases, but rather to identify values that were clearly present with the understanding that any given value may occur only rarely, and many job postings may be entirely devoid of any value statements. Our working theory is that there is no inherent need for employers to reference specific values. Faculty can be hired without reference to values. As a case in point, on August 23rd of 2019, Princeton University posted a position associated with the University Center for Human Values, a posting one might think would be rife with reference to equity and other values. But this job posting contained only the most minimal reference to any value, and it did not evince a principal value. Employers have to make an explicit decision to reference values, and we were looking for these explicit values only if they should occur, and obviously so. Indeed, many postings seem to have a main theme that had nothing to do with the values we consider here. Rather, the goal or the theme seemed to be simply to enumerate and stress just how extensive and difficult the job duties were, the teaching obligations, the committee work. I was a little scared reading some of these postings. So then, the human codes of value content in faculty job postings then served as a gold standard to train machine learning models. The machine learning models were then applied to the entire corpus of those 67,000 job postings, labeling each posting with predicted values on several value-related constructs that we could derive from those initial measures. This slide shows a couple of different estimates of reliability in the human coding process. Inter-rater reliability was assessed from a fully independent coding. No adjudication occurred. And you see these numbers, and they're sort of in the middle. We expected to find non-trivial levels of measurement error in this subjective coding process. Applicants, or our coders, or an applicant, viewing a given posting may come away with different interpretations of how preoccupied the posting is with equity or other values. Likewise, the response options, that requires subjective judgment on the part of the coder, introducing error even if two coders were to agree a value was present to some extent. So that, these numbers are reflecting all of that. At the same time, summarizing these numbers, I would say that there's clearly a great deal of signal in the coding process. Raters are picking up on real differences in the presence of value preoccupations across job postings. And anyway, we shouldn't need measurement error-free codes to pick up on the basic prevalence and trends in values. And I think that bears out in the findings. In the sample of 342 job postings that we coded by hand, we find that equity values are far more prevalent than other values. Across the fields of education, business, and the social sciences, and some others which snuck in, because employers have complete leeway to designate the job field when they post it. So in engineering, they could post that as education if they'd like. We find an overwhelming preponderance of equity values, with other values identified only seldom. Across all these fields, 48%, almost right down the middle, of the job postings were identified as having equity as the principal value. In contrast, quality was identified as the principal value in less than 5% of the postings, while choice and efficiency are present even more rarely than that. 29% required diversity statements as part of the job application. That's the, Interestingly, the correlation between whether there is a required diversity statement and the equity score is quite modest. In the human-coded data, it's 0.34. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Although equity values were present in each of the 4 domains, they were more common in domains 1 and 2, the organizational priorities, values, and commitments, and the qualifications, than in domains 3 and 4, the job focus, duties, and functions, and the focus of the professor's research and expertise, although, again, they were present throughout the postings. In the paper and in a methodological online appendix, we discuss our machine learning architecture for those who are interested. Our model accuracies are pretty good, and about what you would expect given that the error in the human codes puts a rate-limiting factor on accuracies. We achieved accuracies of 0.66 in the correlation metric and 0.734 in the exact agreement metric. We considered a variety of different architectures. In the end, we used traditional supervised machine learning models, feature-based models, rather than large language models like ChatGPT. This traditional approach is faster and cheaper than using an LLM, and you've already reached a point of diminishing returns at that point. Figure 1 shows the time trend in the prevalence of equity values. The y-axis is the equity score, ranging from 1 to 6, which is scaled to approximately the 10th and 90th percentile of the distribution for all years. The percentages above the line shown are the model-based percentage change in equity values relative to 2017, using calculations from regression models that control for some basic features to handle esoteric differences across years in the composition of the sample. Importantly, 2024 is a partial year, including jobs posted through June when we began the study. In recent years, equity values have become especially prevalent, reaching a peak in 2022, which represents an increase of almost 60% from 2017. If the findings from this data are robust, equity values in job postings have now declined somewhat, although they are still hegemonic compared to those other values. This slide presents the time trend in the presence of required DEI statements. Both the raw trend as well as the adjusted percentage change using calculations from multivariate models to help control for esoteric changes in the sample composition. So the raw change is on the y-axis and the adjusted change in the percentage metric is above the line. Trends in required DEI statements, in terms of the shape of that trend, closely mirror our more holistic coding of values, increasing each year until 2022, and then declining in 2023 and 2024. By 2022, from the baseline, the likelihood of a job posting requiring a DEI statement had increased approximately 256%. The use of DEI statements averaged about 25% across the entire study period. So similar to what's in the human coding, but a little bit different because they're predicted values from the language models, not from the human codes. These results on this particular slide are very consistent with those reported elsewhere by Paul and Moranto in reports from FIRE and Heterodox Academy. However, with a large sample, a long time trend, and covariate adjustment, these are the only covariate adjusted results that take into account differences in the sample over time, I think these are the best available estimates of the true underlying trend in this phenomenon. This slide, just for presentation purposes, because we're looking at it on the screen, shows a snapshot of analyses at the department level, just a handful, 5 departments just chosen to put up here. We analyzed several dozen departments over this period in the paper. At the department level, across all years, the percentage of postings with equity as the principal value ranged from a low of 18% to a high of 76%. So the department variation is striking, both in the full table and in this snapshot. Of course, consistent with previous results, the time trend slides would be in the figures. The contrast between, let's say, pre-2020 and after 2020 proportions of jobs with equity as a principal value is pronounced for virtually every department. I don't think there were any departments where this went down. It always goes up. Qualitatively, the depth and specificity of equity values varied by field. In business job postings, equity values were treated quite briefly and generally with language about inclusive environments or celebrating diversity in a broad sense. In contrast, job postings in education addressed equity values more extensively, conveying an especially strong commitment to equity. Education postings contained explicit language about closing achievement gaps, developing and adopting culturally responsive pedagogy, and specific theories such as critical race theory. Education postings reflected a deeper integration of equity into more specific and daily academic responsibilities, as well as more highly elaborated organizational values around equity. I have 4 points to make in this first part of the discussion. First, as others have noted, the job market is a key lever for enacting change in academia. Critics of the current state of higher education argue that the hegemony of critical perspectives is due in large part to changes in the occupational incumbents themselves. Okay? If the values espoused in job postings are in fact determinative of hiring patterns, they would have a profound effect on the balance of values emphasized in academia. In my experience, the content of job postings is acted on from the hiring committees I've sat on. It does affect who applies, from my decision to apply or not to apply, and who gets screened out in the early phases of that committee work. Beyond that direct selection effect, shifts in the value priorities emphasized in job postings may provide a window into the values and commitments that permeate the university more broadly. Their presence may signal values that are acted on in other organizational functions, including promotion and tenure decisions, the organization of the curriculum. Many of these things are much harder to study much harder to do a content analysis of than job postings. My second point, is kind of a discussion-y point, is that the correlation between equity values and required DEI statements is quite modest. It varies from measure to measure, but is always less than 0.5. As one example, 65% of the job applications in the field of higher education management, which is a very equity-focused field, 65% of those applications had equity as the principal value, but only 10% required the candidate to upload a DEI statement. One possible explanation for this is that the screening function of principal values versus required DEI statements are substitutable. Employers can use one or the other to accomplish their goals, but they do not need both. This implies then that the likelihood of applicants, I said it's 50-50 whether they encounter equity as a principal value, but the likelihood of them encountering one or the other, that principal value or a required DEI statement, is even higher than either one alone. A third point, a discussion-y point, is that we hypothesize that the presence of an imbalance in equity values in one particular domain of the posting, the professor's research area or expertise, probably has a particularly strong selection effect on decisions to apply, way stronger even than a required DEI statement. Because at the time of application, it's difficult or impossible to suddenly show evidence of a value focus in one's research, your track record, that isn't really present. It's locked in at that point. My fourth discussion point is I will briefly discuss the potential for bias in this analysis. Could these results just be driven by biased coders? Certainly, this type of study would greatly benefit from replication by a different set of coders. But we do not think bias coding can entirely explain these results for several reasons. First, the imbalance in values we uncovered is so great that even if coders overestimated the presence of equity values by a factor of 2 or 3 times their true prevalence, there would still be an imbalance. Second, the findings and trends seem to align with what other researchers have found. Our trends line up really well with those other analyses. And our analyses of the value preoccupations correspond well to the analyses of the DEI statements, which require much less, it's much easier to code. Third, bias coding might explain the central tendency. Bias coding could explain our point estimate of 48%, but it would not produce the trend found in the automated analysis where that is completely based on machine learning. So that trend has to be some real trend. It had nothing to do with the coding. Overall, we believe inferences from a subjective human coding have value, especially when they are well structured by common domains of job postings and when key heuristics are followed. In this coding, for example, we were careful to not ever code EEO statements as evidence of equity values. We set those aside entirely. What is the essential feature of the 2020 crisis in higher education? There's no easy answer to that question, but I believe a preoccupation with equity is a key part of it. I entered the world of academia in what now seems like a transition period, before the train went flying off the rails. I can remember having to read McIntosh's essay on white privilege as a sociology major at UNC Chapel Hill. But it seemed like an anomalous moment in an otherwise scientific, challenging, and enlightening curriculum. The class's reaction to the McIntosh article was polite and deferential to the professor, but there was the sense that something was a little off with this material. Today, I am a professor in a graduate school of education. Many students in schools of education are taught almost exclusively material like the McIntosh essay. Actually, the McIntosh essay seems tame in comparison to the critical excesses of what today's students encounter. In recent years, the news has been full of awful stories of critical perspectives run amok. These events, starring faculty, starring administrators, including DEI administrators, but also students, are documented in places like the College Fix, Fire, and even the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is where the Glockner essay was at that I showed you today. I wasn't brainwashed by reading the McIntosh article or the following discussion. If that is what the professor felt was valuable for us to read, that's fine. We all have our own sentiments. The problem is not the mere existence of such critical work. Certainly, we still need to expose the worst cases of exploitation when they happen, in the style of the classic muckrakers like Upton Sinclair or Michael Moore. We still need rigorous scientific research on social and educational inequality, like the kind funded by the W.T. Grant Foundation. Students should expect some critique of society and higher education, just as we get critiques of big business and other social institutions when we go to the movies. And I often point out that Hollywood is largely governed by market forces, and it's still much more liberal than other social institutions in America. The problem is one of balance. The mistake we made was allowing huge segments of the higher education sector to become completely preoccupied with critical perspectives on society and one value, equity, above all others. I have made this mistake myself. I've made it in teaching, in peer reviewing scholarly work, in working on various committees, hiring faculty, or developing programs, and beyond. I made that mistake all throughout my job as a faculty member. Too many times, I failed to keep the wisdom of folks like Coleman in mind. I let the work of my colleagues, the work that I was doing with my colleagues, be guided by an exclusive and excessive focus on equity. Traditionally, higher education has been guided by multiple values at once. Equity, certainly, but also quality, efficiency, and choice. Certainly, society expects colleges and universities, as well as the K-12 sector, to be guided by a plurality of values. John Goodlad once characterized America's value emphases with the summary statement, "We want it all." America as a whole, Goodlad was trying to pick up on the general sentiment in our culture. America as a whole, not just Donald Trump's inner circle, is collectively frustrated that a singular value focus has come to dominate so much of higher education. And I think almost all of us in the world of higher education have some blame to take on this. That the present study shows that the value preoccupation with equity peaked in 2022 is good news. But make no mistake, we are still a long way from balanced. The conceptual frame I presented today is a powerful tool that can help guide us out of this crisis. John McWhorter wrote the brave book, Woke Racism, which was published in 2021. Not surprisingly, McWhorter struggled a little in the final chapter of that book, offering a blueprint to help us get out of the critical paradigm stranglehold. I mean, it's just really hard to think of solutions. What in the world do we do now? He does offer some advice. He advises that we just say no to woke racist dictates. Simultaneously, he adds, we must get used to the consequence that we will then be labeled as racist by many of our colleagues. I mean, the thing about McWhorter's advice is that it was so timely. His good advice came just when it was desperately needed. But his recommendations are too passive. We are going to need to do even more. We must refocus our work in higher education away from persuasion and back to knowledge generation. When we tackle social issues, we should be focused on interrogating competing perspectives, not hammering away at a single perspective. Most importantly, we must proactively advance and affirm the multiple value dimensions in higher education. When quality, efficiency, choice, and other values are missing from the discussion, we must speak up. We got in this mess because critical scholars constantly emphasized equity and equity alone until it became so normative to do so, we barely even noticed something was amiss. We must now actively, vigorously, and loudly reaffirm the multiple values that we have long cared about. Specifically, organizational artifacts, things like job postings, but every other organizational document as well, as much as possible, should reflect multiple values or no values at all. With regard to job postings, I see no reason to mention values at all. Value mandates should be removed from funding, publishing, and other facets of knowledge generation. The curriculum should be organized with the goal of balanced attention to a plurality of values. Some scholars are alarmed at efforts by states to reorganize the curriculum away from identity-based departments, etc. But states that provide financial support to public universities have a right to, as we say in education, to coordinate the curriculum, just as they do in K-12 education. This was a theme from last night's keynote. The taxpayer expects this. We wouldn't fund a public elementary school that failed to teach math, and we shouldn't provide funding to universities whose curriculum is badly skewed away from the knowledge generation we want and need. Finally, I think traditional disciplines should be emphasized instead of scholarship tightly tied to a singular value. Some academic work has been characterized as grievance studies, and unfortunately that characterization seems accurate to me. Traditional departments like psychology, even with the flaws that Jussim and his colleagues have identified, or sociology, etc., I think they're inherently less prone to value imbalance than more narrow identity-based fields of inquiry. To conclude, I'll offer one final anecdote. A student, a polite man, I work a lot with older students. They've already had first careers as teachers, or maybe they're principals or something like that. He asked me, Dr. Kelly, are you a scholar activist? I replied, no, I'm a scholar. To that, I might add, nor am I entirely preoccupied with equity. I didn't say that at the time, but I would say that now. People are not used to hearing this, but it needs to be said. James Coleman said it. Karl Barks said it. And in light of the results I shared with you today, it seems like it does need to be said. Thank you.
So we have 4 minutes. Wes.
Yeah, I had a question about your prescriptions at the end. You were in favor of value absent, I guess, job ads and like funding applications and that sort of thing. I was thinking, though, that a lot of the job ads and the funding proposals, they will be evaluated according to particular values. And so maybe it would be better to get those up front, more transparency about the values that are going to inform the evaluation of the job applicants and the funding proposals.
Possibly, yeah.
Three minutes.
Thank you. I was curious why you're characterizing the paradigm that you're criticizing as critical when it seems like it's dogmatic. Something I saw randomly on Twitter, I wish I would have come up with it, but somebody said critical theory should be called hypocritical theory since it's critical about everything else. So, like, the thing that you're calling critical is dogmatism. Like, and one of the points of dogmatism is this idea that all of our values align with equity. We never have to trade off equity and other values. That's why we come up with slogans like inclusive excellence. Like, there's no trade-off between exclusivity and excellence. And when you say you're rejecting this critical paradigm, it makes it sound as though you want to take something out of the critical domain, but that's not right, right? You want to criticize dogmas, right?
I hear what you're saying. No, I mean, putting terms to these things is you could go different ways. That's the critical. That's just the term from sociology. They call it the critical paradigm, not me. It's called the critical paradigm in the literature by Randall Collins. And going back even maybe even further than that. And of course, today the word critical shows up in in the most contemporary versions of these theories include the word critical, and the scholars themselves use the word critical. So that's why I use it.
Hi. Asking people to give up on the concept of equity seems like a heavy lift, especially in disciplines like sociology and psychology, where it's just baked into the way that a lot of our colleagues think.
Yeah.
Couldn't what you're talking about, though,
Well,
be described just
I didn't
as...
say give up on it. I never
Well, no,
said-
well,
never
no.
said give-
To dial it back, but couldn't what you're talking about be described just as easily as we care at least as much about equity as you guys do, only with a view to the equity interests of the students? All we care about is having outstanding teachers. We want precisely the most disadvantaged students to benefit from the best teachers, and we don't want to have anybody who's not an awesome teacher. And maybe we do care about racial balance among the teachers, but only to the extent that it affects the students. And rather than the equity interests of some underemployed PhD, and we're just going to say we don't care about the underemployed PhDs. All we care about is the students.
Yeah.
Does that get at what you're saying, or are we would that be
Well,
missing something?
Let me speak to it. First, I never said give up on equity, right? That's not it at all. The question is, when a preoccupation becomes so singular that the other values are set aside. And one of the things that policy researchers routinely come back to over and over is how interrelated these three values are in the policy realm and in schools and classrooms. So that's part of it, is that they are always interrelated. But no, I think it's gotten to the point where certain critical scholars would say, well, I don't care about the mean. I don't care about raising the mean. I care only about equity.
Well, thanks again to Professor Kelly.
Thank you.